To call yourself the Leaguie, you have to watch a lot of rugby league and watch it closely. What that means is that I see every performance from every player, including those who don't get a lot of media attention but probably deserve to. Those guys are there in every top 30, and in fact premiership success is built upon getting value out of guys like that. In this video I will cover the guys from your club who you probably love but who nobody else talks about. Starting off with the West Tigers, I already want to give it to two guys. Not like that. The unlucky one to miss out will be 20-year-old Samuela Fainu, who has played all but one game for the Tigers this season and made his last 13 appearances as a starting back rower. But for me, the Tigers' most underrated player is Fonua Pole. The 22-year-old has already played over 50 NRL games, and to me his form this season has been a cut above established players like Isaiah Papali'i and John Bateman. Pole is currently averaging over 100 meters, he is breaking a couple of tackles every game, and he's tackling at over 90%. That's super solid for a front rower, and the fact that he could have a decade left in the NRL is an exciting prospect. For the Eels, I've gone with Brendan Hands. Now, the number 9 jersey at Parramatta has been one of the least stable positions in the NRL over the last couple of years. It's chopped and changed between combinations of Josh Hodgson, Joey Lussick, and Brendan Hands, but to me, Hands has always stood out. And the Eels now agree, starting him at hooker in his last 7 appearances. I'm not claiming that he's a world beater, but he's a serviceable 9 who is crafty around the ruck. He is capable of making things happen. He tackles at over 90% as well, which is great for a small guy in the middle. But probably my favourite fact about Hands is that he scored a try on debut to beat the Penrith Panthers and hasn't scored in his 31 games since. For South Sydney, I've gone with a guy who has hardly played this season in Isaiah Tass. The 24-year-old injured his ankle way back in round 9, which ruled him out for the rest of the season. But honestly, I do really rate Tass. During the preseason when people were going through their best 17s for South Sydney, most people didn't have him there. It was Alex Johnson and Tyrone Munro on the wings, with Campbell Graham and Jack Whiten in the centres. But Tass is absolutely a first-grade quality outside back, and if next preseason he still finds himself stuck behind other guys in the pecking order, well, this phrase does get overused, but there are other clubs out there who could use him. Next up is the Titans, a team whose players I think just generally don't get as much attention as they deserve, but the guy that stands out to me is the great Chris Randall. Since moving up from the Newcastle Knights, Randall has been a brilliant clubman for the Gold Coast. In his 2 seasons with the club, he has played hooker, front row, 5/8, lock, and come off the bench. At times, he's even been able to keep premiership winner Sam Verrills out of the number 9 jersey. He's the kind of player who coaches love, tackling at 94% and hardly ever making an error. He was a bit of a late bloomer, making his NRL debut age 24, but now at 28 I can see him being a very solid part of this Titans side for the next 3 to 4 years. Brisbane are another club who to me have 2 guys that probably deserve a mention. The one who misses out will be Jesse Arthurs, who I doubted had what it took to be an NRL first grader when he was bouncing around clubs at the start of his career. But he has absolutely achieved that now and was really good last season. But the man who I reckon is the Broncos' most underrated player has to be Corey Jensen. He had absolutely massive shoes to fill this year, with Origin front rower Thomas Flegler departing the club, and he has done a very good job of it. Obviously, all the attention in the Broncos front row will be on Payne Haas and Patrick Carrigan. But Jensen has started all but one game this season alongside those two, averaging 130 meters and tackling at 95%. In a very disappointing year for Brisbane, which warrants a video in itself, I think he's earned the right to be pretty proud of what he's individually provided. Onto the Wires, I've gone with Rocco Berry, a fan favourite over there, but once again a guy who you never really hear mentioned over here. Berry has missed a huge chunk of this season with a shoulder injury that has ruled him out indefinitely, but when he's match fit, he is a walk-up starter for this Warriors side. He is only 23 years old, but would already have 50 NRL games to his name if not for this injury. And he's a guy who I can see being a part of the Warriors' core for the long-term future. And don't be surprised if he ends up a mainstay in the New Zealand Kiwis side too later in his career. Newcastle are a side who I struggled with, to be honest, because I simply think that their players are appropriately rated. But a guy who I'm always excited to see when he plays is Brodie Jones. He's not always selected in the first grade side, but his matches this season have been up on the last 2 years. He's a guy who to me has a real dynamism about him. Having been born up there in Maitland and having made his way up through the Knights junior side, I think his love for the club is reflected in the way that he plays. Still only 26 years old, I think he can be a really solid clubman for the Knights for the foreseeable future. Seeing a guy who cares about that club just as much as their passionate fans do really is fantastic. Next up for the Dragons, I've gone with a guy who, to be fair, we've known has had potential for a long time. It's hooker Jacob Liddle. Liddle really struggled to cement a first grade side in his 7 seasons with the Tigers, averaging only 10 games a year and having a win rate of only 34%. But he's found a home in the number 9 role since moving to the Dragons and has been a really solid part of their success this season. St George Illawarra have recruited former Origin hooker Damien Cook on a 2-year deal starting next season, but while he is a much more established player than Liddle, I don't see him as a walk-up starter the way that I did when that signing was announced. And that is down to what Jacob Liddle has shown this season. Keeping the hooker theme for the Canberra Raiders, I'm going with Tom Starling. Now, I won't pretend to know more about Starling than Ricky Stewart does, but I'm gonna be honest, it has really surprised me over the last couple of seasons how few minutes he plays for the Raiders. In fairness, over the last month he's averaging 74 minutes, but before that this season he was averaging only 28. To me, he's clearly the best number 9 in the nation's capital, and given that they have a spine that lacks experience, I think him playing big minutes is very overdue. For such a little man, he is a good middle defender, and still aged only 26, he's got a lot of improvement left in him. For the Dolphins, I've gone with a man who I see play State of Origin in the not too distant future. It is Max Plath. The hooker/lock style player has become a super important asset in the modern game. We've seen it this year with the likes of Connor Watson, Chris Randall, and even Reece Robson. Plath is cut from the same cloth as those guys. He's a dynamic player who, despite only being 22 years of age and only having played 18 NRL games, has started almost every game this season at lock. He tackles at 95% and provides valuable ball playing through the middle. In Plath, the Dolphins have a guy who I think they can really build around once the initial leadership group of Felice Kaufusi and the Bromwich brothers move on. Next up for the Manly Sea Eagles, I've gone with young Queenslander Ethan Bullymore. The 24-year-old already has 76 NRL appearances to his name, and despite being sort of in and out of first grade during the start of his career, he has really nailed down a spot over the last 2 seasons. Bullymore is another guy who just brings a certain dynamism to the game. His leg speed is very good and he tackles at a whopping 96%. Possibly my favourite thing about him though is that while he's not fulfilling his obligations with the Sea Eagles, he works as an analyst at an investment firm in Sydney. And he's studying a Masters of Business at UNSW. For a guy who plays like a good old school forward, it is very old school for him to have a job alongside playing first grade. For the Cowboys, I've got a guy who may be one of the most underrated players in this entire video. I've gone with 26-year-old Sam McIntyre. He has not been a consistent first grader for the vast majority of his career, and when the Cowboys picked him up midway through last season, he wasn't seen as anything more than a depth signing. But the former Titan has played every game for the Cowboys this season and has done so solidly. Yet I reckon the vast majority of NRL fans would walk past McIntyre in the street without recognising him. He's probably one of the best value for money players in the NRL, and if he continues to do what he's currently doing for the Cowboys, he will be a valuable member of their squad moving forward. And speaking of value for money, how about another guy who left the Titans midway through last season in Toby Sexton? He's won 78% of his games since coming in at halfback for the Doggies this season, and still aged only 23, he could have a massive future ahead of him. At a time when the likes of Ben Hunt and Daly Cherry Evans are approaching the end of their State of Origin careers, everyone is rightfully talking about the likes of Sam Walker and Tom Dearden. But if Sexton and the Dogs can continue to build upon what they're doing this season, he could only be an injury away from playing State of Origin throughout his career. All of the attention this season for Canterbury has rightfully been on the likes of Stephen Crichton and Matt Burton. But if the Dogs do secure a top 4 spot this season, Toby Sexton deserves his praise, and he'll absolutely be getting it from me. Moving up into the top 4 now, Cronulla are a bit of a tricky one. Ever since Craig Fitzgibbon came in as coach, he has kept a very consistent 17, and so those 17 players do get a fair amount of praise and attention. But I'm going to go with Teague Wilton, who in this star-studded side is a consistent starter, and who actually captained the Sharks earlier this season despite only being 24 years of age. He's a guy who is often overshadowed by the very high quality players in this Cronulla side, but when he, of all people, is chosen to be captain, even if it was just a one-off game, it is a massive testament to his character and what he brings to the Sharks. It's a similarly tough question for the Chookies because 1 through 17 they're all pretty much established stars. But to me, there's a young forward at East who not enough people outside the Roosters circle are talking about. It's Naufahu White. White is still only 22 years of age, but has really cemented a spot this season, playing all but 3 games for the Roosters this year. Few people know this, but he was actually selected to be part of the New Zealand Kiwis side last season, despite only having 8 NRL games to his name. With Jared Waerea-Hargreaves departing at the end of this season, White will be a player who's expected to step up and play a more prominent role in their middle rotation in years to come. For the 3-time premiers, I've gone with Nathan Clitt. I'm kidding. It's Mitch Kenny. It's pretty rare that a team with such consistent success would have a guy with Kenny's standing in the spine. The Storm have Harry Grant, the Roosters have Brandon Smith, but Kenny's a player who came into first grade faced with the task of deputising for and eventually replacing the great Api Coruscant, and nobody could be disappointed by the way that he's done it. Kenny regularly plays 80 minutes for the Panthers, which is crucial to their rotation and allows them to carry a 4-forward bench if they need to. As this Panthers side goes down in history, it will be remembered for the likes of Cleary, Luai, To'o, Yo, Edwards. But I think Penrith fans will always remember just how important Mitch Kenny was to this side. And finally, we reach our 17th team in the Melbourne Storm, and it's the player who actually gave me the idea for this video, Tyran Wishart. The 24-year-old has become a very high-quality Mr. Fix-It over the first 47 games of his career. Over that time, he has played fullback, winger, 5/8, halfback, and come off the bench to play hooker. His versatility may be what costs him a starting spot in this Melbourne side, but in a game with sin bins and HIAs, you could do a lot worse than to have Tyran Wishart filling in. And geez, his form when Munster was injured earlier this season was exceptional. And there we have it, the most underrated player from each team in the NRL. Let me know who you think I missed from your team, and I'll see you later.